In this series, and exclusive to this channel, you'll hear a word-for-word account of what the jury were told after hearing 9 months of evidence during Lucy Letby's original trial. Now, with so much harmful misinformation currently being spread online and in mainstream publications surrounding this case, this series seeks to provide for the first time exactly what transpired in court. That means no ill-informed commentary or any bias, simply the evidence as presented during the trial itself. This video has been made possible by the purchasing of court-approved transcripts, further details of which can be found in the video description box below. What you'll hear next is a detailed summary of the prosecution's case against Lucy Letby. This took place at Manchester Crown Court and was conducted by Nicholas Johnson, KC. I'm going to move on to the cases of child L and M. On Friday the 8th of April 2016, at about 10:15 in the morning, the mother of child L and M told us that she gave birth to her twin boys. Lucy Letby was present at the birth, and when child L was admitted to the neonatal unit at 10:30 that morning, he was generally well, but his breathing rate was a little elevated, which we heard is not unusual for a premature baby. His low blood sugar was a problem from the beginning, and again, you heard from more than one witness, I think, that that's not particularly unusual for premature underweight babies. You'll remember that Dr. Bomick told us about the calculation of the fluids that she prescribed to child L, but she didn't recall discussing it with the nurses. She didn't monitor the time that the infusion started, and Dr. Bomick couldn't really remember anything that wasn't in the notes. But if we look at tile 13, please, this shows us Lucy Letby's nursing note, which was written at the end of the shift. You can see the time 17:42. This particular note relates to the time at which Dr. Bomick prescribed dextrose and continues, quote, "Myself and shift leader A. Davies have discussed this with Registrar Bomick as it doesn't follow the hypoglycemia pathway." You'll remember in that context, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence of Arian Powell on April 27th this year, when she said that Lucy Letby would not shirk to challenge a doctor if she thought a mistake had been made. Amy Davies didn't recall this conversation, although Amy Davies did confirm that usually milk would be given as a first resort under the pathway. Nurse Davies said that the infusion therapy prescription sheet showed that she had checked what was being given to child L, and in challenging Dr. Bomick and documenting it, we suggest that Lucy Letby was setting up an issue for child L in the sense that she had identified an anomaly and had decided to use it as a cover to attack child L. You'll remember I suggested as much to Lucy Letby when I was questioning her. The night shift of the 8th into the 9th was a shift on which Tracy Jones was the nurse looking after child L, and you'll remember her probably as the highly qualified agency nurse. Although she was operating as a Band 5 at Chester, she was in fact qualified as a Band 8A, which is apparently beyond any of the nurses that we have heard from the hospital itself. She took over child L's care that night and recorded that child L's blood sugars improved to the extent that the monitoring was discontinued. Tracy Jones told us that she didn't change any IV bag for child L, so she didn't change the dextrose. And so it follows that the bag that was put up by Lucy Letby during the day shift when child L was admitted was the same bag that was running through the night shift and was still running at the beginning of the day shift. So we come to the day shift of Saturday, April 9th. You'll remember that Mary Griffith was the designated nurse for both babies L and M in Nursery 1. If we look at tile 88, please, we can see there were 4 children in Nursery 1, the babies L and M, and 2 others who were both being looked after by Lucy Letby. Mary Griffith told us in cross-examination that it was a busy shift in Nursery 1. Quite how that bears on the issue of insulin finding its way into child L's bag of dextrose will be for you to decide. But we suggest that if people were very busy, it might mean that they are not in a position always to monitor what somebody else, and in particular somebody like Lucy Letby, was up to. If you look at the neonatal review, which is in the black file, you'll see that Mary Griffith was certainly out of the room at about 9:30. So in other words, about an hour and a half after the shift started. Because she was with Angela McShane in Nursery 4, administering medications to children in there. You will remember the evidence we heard from a number of different witnesses that medications were always given by a registered nurse. So it would follow, we suggest, that it was Mary Griffith actually administering medicines in Nursery 4 at 9:30. That means Lucy Letby would have been alone with child L in Nursery 1 at that time. And if you put that together, we suggest, with the evidence of Professor Hindmarsh, who said it would be about 9:30 that somebody put insulin into child L's dextrose bag. Before we get to when the insulin went in, I'm going to deal with the evidence which proves, we suggest, that child L was poisoned. Mary Griffith remembered that child L had low blood sugars. If we go to tile 97, please, we can see that she took a blood sample from child L at about 10 o'clock for serum bilirubin and blood sugar. And she was shocked, she told us, by the coincidence of an increase in the amount of dextrose that was being given, the increase in the dextrose, with the reduction with a drop in child L's blood sugar. Because the opposite should have been true, because his blood sugar had regularized overnight at about midnight. Here he is being given more sugar, yet the blood sugar is decreasing. As with child F, what we suggest is the irrefutable evidence or the fingerprint of poisoning comes from the disparity in the ratio of the levels of C-peptide and insulin. One issue that we spent quite a lot of time dealing with in evidence was the time at which Mary Griffith took the blood sample from the lab. Do you remember that? This was the one where the podding of the sample was delayed because of child M's collapse. The issue in evidence became, was the blood sample taken at about midday, or was it taken at about 15:45 or thereabouts? It's an important point in the case of child M as well. So not just child L, but child M as well, for reasons that we will come to. In order to work out when the sample was taken from child L, we have to look at the evidence given by several witnesses and what is contained in the documents that were created at about this time. So that you understand where we're coming from, ladies and gentlemen, we suggest that the blood sample which showed that child L had been poisoned must have been taken at about 15:45. In other words, about 15 minutes or so before his brother collapsed and had to have CPR. Although she said that she couldn't remember the time that the sample was taken, Mary Griffith did say that when it was taken it would have been treated as urgent. She also remembered that when it was taken, she had been distracted by an emergency with child M. And we know what time the emergency was with child M. It was about 1600 hours. So that evidence in itself suggests that the sample was taken between 15:45 and 1600. Mary Griffith said that the blood was put into a vial, a small tube and an envelope, both of which were labelled. She explained that the printing of the labels is an automatic process which is initiated by the order on the computer, and that the labels are important because you need to get the right tubes to take the sample in, because the chemicals, the reagents as they call them, in the tube have to be the right ones for specific tests. So the tests have to be ordered. That determines the tubes which the blood goes into, which in turn is what is required. So it follows that the nurse needs to know what the test is or what the test is to be conducted by the lab so that he or she, the nurse, can use the proper tube. Emma Jane Lewis, who is a consultant biochemist at the hospital, told us how the requesting system works. What she had to say supports our contention that this sample was taken at about 15:45. Because she said that when a request for a test is made, it's logged in the hospital system. You can see the request for this test was entered at 15:45, which is the time we suggest is about the time it was taken. That process of entering that information into that database initiates the production of the labels, which is a prerequisite for the taking of the test because it determines, as I say, the type of tube into which the blood is decanted to send for testing. So we know from that time-stamped evidence that Dr. Yuko ordered the insulin C-peptide test at 15:45. If we put that information alongside the evidence of Mary Griffith that the podding of the blood was interrupted by the collapse of child M, you know to an accuracy of 15 minutes or so when the blood sample must have been taken, because its processing and analysis were interrupted by Lucy Letby's attack on child M. So just going back to what happened earlier that morning, Dr. Yuko had examined child L at 10:20. He took us through the notes. In addition to his tube feed, child L was getting a dose of 10% dextrose for a cannula because his bloods were low. And Dr. Yuko decided to increase the dextrose dose. He said that he needed to be informed if the blood sugars remained low. Because the levels of child L's blood sugar were so low, he ordered the blood test. If we go to tile 111, please, and go back 2 pages in the paper document to page 17998, we'll get to the same material. When Dr. Yuko was pointed to that, he thought, didn't he, that 12 noon was a reference to the time when the blood sample was taken. So this is where the confusion arose. I'm dealing with the issue of the confusion. We say Dr. Yuko cannot be right about that because the computerized timestamp form proves that he ordered the test at 15:45, and that, as I've said, would have been the prerequisite for the tubes, etc. So with regards to Dr. Yuko's handwritten note that you can see there, we say that's a red herring, and I'll give you a number of reasons why noon is a red herring here. First of all, we know that this information was written at a later date. It wasn't written at the time. Because Dr. Yuko told us by reference to the front of the form that it was his handwriting on the front on the 11th and 12th of April. In other words, a couple of days after this blood test was ordered. The second reason that this is a red herring is that the cortisol and the growth hormone readings on the back of the form were not actually verified until April 11th from the lab. So they weren't available, in other words, on April 9th. And third, the PTO on the front of the form at the bottom must have been written at the same time as the material on the back of the form. Otherwise, why would you write PTO on the front? So far as the timing of the blood sample is concerned, this form, we say, is a complete red herring. The final piece of evidence that points to the blood sample being taken at 15:45 is the coincidence of the administration of the bolus of dextrose being given by Lucy Letby and Mary Griffith at 15:40. You can see the bolus of dextrose given at 15:40. You can see time infusion started in the second to right-hand column. The third one up is 15:40. It's a 4.3 ml 10% dextrose bolus given at 15:40, prescribed at 15:35 by Dr. Yuko. And that coincides, if you remember, with the raised level of the blood sugar in the lab sample. So do you remember, there's a slight anomaly between the blood sugar levels going through the day and the one that went to the lab. The one that went to the lab, the blood sugar level was slightly higher, and Professor Hindmarsh told us that the reason for that, what appears to be an anomaly, is not an anomaly at all. It's accounted for by the administration of this bolus at 15:40. So in other words, just before the sample was taken. So all the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, we suggest points towards this blood sample having been taken by Mary Griffith at about 15:45. Going to page 18025, please, in those documents, which is back to where we were before, Dr. Gibbs helped us with this and he told us what you already know. The high insulin level, in conjunction with the low C-peptide, is in effect a fingerprint of the introduction of manufactured insulin. In other words, somebody poisoned child L. He told us that the low blood sugar level should have meant that child L's insulin level was low too, because the body, if it's producing its own insulin, automatically cuts off if the blood sugar level gets low. And you'll remember that Dr. Gibbs drew conclusions about what was going on at the time. And it had never occurred to him at the time that somebody had been giving insulin to child L. And he had never, Dr. Gibbs that is, received the lab results. They went a few days later to the junior doctors, who didn't appreciate their significance. Well, those results were also tested too by Dr. Milan from the lab at Liverpool. She gave evidence on February 20th. She confirmed that the samples were properly labelled, that this was a check which was done more than once during the process. The machinery was checked and calibrated daily, and the staff were properly and fully trained. The processes are overseen and checked by the manufacturers and by UCAS. The machine's results are then reviewed by a human biochemist, and child L's blood sample was received in Liverpool on April 11th. The levels were C-peptide 264 millimoles and 1099 picomoles of insulin. And she produced another document which you have as 26995 with the results, and made the same point that Dr. Gibbs made about the disconnect in the ratio between C-peptide and insulin. And she said, in no uncertain terms, the only way you can get a pattern like that is if insulin is given to the patient. Dr. Sarah Davies, another scientist who obtained the results in Liverpool and sent them to Chester, phoned them through because they were so unusual. Dr. Milan confirmed that a failure to deal with things as they should have been. Do you remember her being asked about the stability of the analyte? In other words, the thing to be analysed. And she told us that if it hadn't been put on ice properly, that would have reduced the reading for the insulin because that's not as stable, but it wouldn't have reduced the reading for the C-peptide. So the result would have been even more marked if that had an effect on the result. So you can discount that, we suggest, as being a problem. You may remember Dr. Gwen Walk. She was one of the few people with a Scots accent who gave evidence in this case. She was a director of the UK National External Quality Assessment Service, and summarising her evidence, she told us that the lab at Liverpool was performing very well. So we suggest that the evidence on this point is really all one way. You can discount as a possibility that these lab results are in any way misleading. As I've already said, the amount of insulin in child L's blood was more than double what had been found in child F's. And that, we suggest, speaks volumes. We suggest that the person who poisoned child F must be responsible for poisoning child L. The idea that there were two separate people in this neonatal unit separately spiking fluid bags is so improbable that it can be discounted as a reasonable possibility. Child F had survived, so the poisoner Lucy Letby upped the dose for child L. As I've said before, what clearer evidence of an intention to kill could you have? The next question then, ladies and gentlemen, is when did the insulin go into the bag? Well, we say it was put into the bag after it was hung, and this is one of the reasons why it was a targeted attack. Child L, as I've already said, had had the same bag of dextrose running from about midday on the previous day, and it ran until about midday on April 9th. If you go to jury bundle number 1, please, behind divider 6, you will find the table to which Professor Hindmarsh referred when he gave evidence. If you can look at that, and we can put up tile 10 in the child L sequence, please, this shows the hanging of the bag. You'll remember that there was a slight doubt about whether it says 1200 hours or 1210. It doesn't really make any difference. You can see that Lucy Letby's initials, signature, appears next to it. That shows that she was responsible for or took co-responsibility for hanging the bag. So that's on the 9th. What we see above it is the previous bag that was hung the previous day at midday. Do you see that at the top, right at the top? Signed and co-signed by Lucy Letby and Nurse Davies. Looking at that table that you have behind divider 6, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Hindmarsh told us that the first bag, the one hung on April 8th, was not poisoned before the reading taken by Nurse Tracy Jones at midnight on April 8th, 9th. The reason it wasn't poisoned before then is that if you look at the blood sugar readings, they're following a general upward trend, which wouldn't have been the case if there had been insulin in the bag on April 8th. So far as the blip in that process is concerned, that's at 1600, you can see there's a reading of 5.8. That coincided with an upping of the dose. So that's what Professor Hindmarsh told us. According to the evidence, the uncontroverted evidence of Professor Hindmarsh, it must follow that insulin was put into the first bag sometime between midnight, which is that reading of 3.6 at 2400 hours, and 10 o'clock, 1000 hours on the 9th. Making allowances for the half-life of insulin, which I referred to earlier, that pushes the time back 24 minutes. So insulin went into the bag sometime at or before 9:36, if that blood sample at 10 o'clock is an accurate record of the time it was taken. Okay? With me so far? So it didn't go in on the 8th, it went in sometime between midnight at the beginning of the 9th and about 9:30 on the 9th. So given that it actually went into a bag that was hanging on the cot or the incubator, it has to have been a targeted attack, doesn't it? That child L was deliberately selected by the poisoner for that insulin. So it's not a random poisoning. And it must also follow, mustn't it, that whoever is responsible was on duty between midnight and 9:30. And that significantly reduces the possibilities. You are entitled, when looking at the answers, what answers you think can be drawn from this sort of evidence, to look at what was going on with child F as well. So put them together and see where the coincidences coincide. You'll want to ask yourselves whether the person who poisoned child L is a different person to the poisoner of child F. We say it must have been the same person. You'll bear in mind, won't you, that whoever, if it is the same person, they've got away with poisoning child F at this point, April 9th. So they would be pretty confident, wouldn't they, that they'd hit on a reasonably secure way of trying to kill babies, a way that was not being picked up by the hospital, just so long as it wasn't done too often. So here we have a gap of 7 or 8 months between the poisoning of child F in August 2015 and the poisoning of child L in April 2016. Now, Lucy Letby came on duty on April 9th between 7:30 and 8 a.m. She knew child L had a naturally occurring hypoglycemia because of her conversation with Dr. Bomick, which was recorded in the nursing notes. And therefore, he was a perfect target, wasn't he? And she also by that stage introduced the spectre of a naturally occurring issue and a failure to deal with it in accordance with the pathway or the protocol. The insulin that poisoned child L was put into more than one dextrose bag, and the staff who were on duty at the time and at the time child F was poisoned have all told you that they were not responsible. Because there was insulin in more than one bag, something you might be asked to consider is whether these bags were left randomly by someone other than Lucy Letby, and it just happens that child L got them. Well, there are many reasons why we suggest you can exclude that as a possibility. The most important is the one I've already given you, that the first poisoning was done while the bag was actually hanging. The second is that the second bag he got went to him as well. So let's just look, if we can, back at that chart I was referring to before, the chart that was referred to by Professor Hindmarsh. So we know that there was insulin in the bag by 1000 hours on the 9th, and we know that Lucy Letby was in the room. We also know that Mary Griffith was not in the room because she was in nursery 4 giving medication to children there. Mary Griffith had not been working when child F was poisoned. There was a second bag given to child L. That's 4 lines up from the bottom of the table. It's the one at midday. So that was poisoned as well. A third bag was given to child L, which you see over the page. It's the one that appears in the table at 16:30, because that's the time in the records. But you know, as a matter of evidence, that that bag was changed at 16:30. You know that that was being put together because it was a more concentrated bag. You know that that was being put together at about the time child M collapsed, and therefore Mary Griffith went back to child M, and 2 other nurses took over the preparation of the 12.5% bag. Somebody also spiked that bag. You may think, when you think about it, that that bag was in all likelihood spiked whilst it was hanging as well. Because if, as Belinda Simcock told us, everything had to be changed because Mary Griffith was interrupted and they started with a fresh bag, then it would mean that after that bag was hung, it must have been spiked. Of course, Lucy Letby was there at that stage, and we suggest that the evidence shows that. Given that she was the person that spiked the bag at 9:30, it doesn't take much to infer that she must also have been the person that spiked the bag sometime after it was hung at 16:30. Further bags were hung on the 10th at 02:30 and on the 11th at 01:45. We can see that as that period went, so looking down the blood sugar column, we can see that once the 15% bag went up at 02:30 or 0300, there was a general upward tick in the blood sugar levels. That is accounted for by the fact that it was the giving set that had previously been used with the contaminated dextrose that was leaching, in effect, insulin as the new bags were put up. Do you remember? We had some evidence about whether giving sets are changed and whether they're not changed. But as Professor Hindmarsh explained to us, an explanation, and a reasonable explanation for these results, is that there was insulin that had stuck to the plastic of the giving set, that even though the bag was changed for bags that didn't have insulin in, the insulin was still coming off the giving set and therefore in ever diminishing quantities, but it was still affecting the blood sugar results. So the fact that Lucy Letby wasn't there after about 8 p.m, we suggest, doesn't exculpate her at all. And the fact here, if you think about it, if you go back to the beginning, it has to have been someone that was on the ward in the room, we say at about 9:30 on the morning of the 9th. And that, inevitably, is Lucy Letby. So just step back, ladies and gentlemen, we say, and ask yourselves, did somebody do this to frame Lucy Letby? Because that's the only alternative we suggest to her being the person who is responsible. And if Lucy Letby didn't do it, then whoever did it also targeted child F, and they also targeted Lucy Letby to take the blame. It must be, mustn't it? This is why all the other cases are so important as well, isn't it? Look at all those coincidences as well. It just doesn't work. If the aftermath of this poisoning on the night shift of the 9th to the 10th, Tracy Jones was child L's designated nurse, she continued to document the blood sugars. She denied being the person responsible. She, in reality, we suggest, is the only other reasonable possibility. It wasn't suggested on Lucy Letby's behalf that she was the person responsible. Dr. Gibbs got involved during the day shift on Sunday the 10th. He examined child L at about 10 a.m, and as I say, what happened thereafter is all explicable by insulin having come off the giving set. So that's child L.